shall we crack on then? Yeah? So I'm Jostein Hauge. I'm a PhD student in development studies here at the University of Cambridge. Sometimes I just tell people that I'm a PhD student in economics for a few reasons. Some people just don't know what development is, what it means, the development of what? Developmental psychology, biology, what? The other is actually that the question most central to my research is one of the most important questions that are posed by economists, which is why have some countries experienced rapid growth in incomes over the past century, while others stay mired in poverty? Now this is actually the first sentence of chapter 1 of Gregory Mankiw's Introduction to Macroeconomics, which is what the Marshall Library librarian told me the other day, the most commonly used macroeconomics textbook by undergraduates here at Cambridge. So my lecture today will be on, well, the title is Growth of the Least Developed Economies, Opening the Black Box of Production and Technology. And the title of this lecture series is Paper 0, Some Neglects of Neoclassical Economics. So I thought I would plow through the 60 pages of that book that touches upon growth theory. So I did the other day, and to really see how students are first introduced to growth theory when they first study economics. I did my undergraduate degree in economics, so I've studied this model quite in depth myself, but I really forgot it all when I started studying economics of the real world. So students are first introduced to this through the solo growth model. Now the model shows that in the long run, an economy's rate of saving determines the size of its capital stock and thus the level of production. The higher the rate of saving, the higher the stock of capital and the higher the level of output, in other words, growth. So the growth in savings and thereby the growth of the rate of capital stock is endogenous to the model. Another factor that affects the growth rate is technological progress, which is exogenous to the model. So in short, savings usually translated to investments, and technological progress is important to economic growth. I completely agree with that. But how technological change takes place, and more specifically, if and how an economy's production structure determines the rate of technological progress in terms of productivity is not really talked about in the model. Now the reason we have to enter the world of production is because the stuff or the things that a country makes really determines its rate of growth. Or put differently, those countries that actually make things and stuff, they become rich, but the countries that don't make things stay mired in poverty, to quote Mankiw's first sentence in chapter 1 of macroeconomics. A couple of weeks ago, Vasiliki talked about industrial policy. In this lecture series, I'm going to talk about slightly similar things. I will, however, talk mostly about the manufacturing sector and how least developed countries in the world, mostly those in Sub-Saharan Africa, how they're doing in this respect, and what these countries can do, or some of the things that the countries can do to achieve the transformation we're looking for the least developed countries to achieve. Now, there are 3 points, or if you want to take away 3 points from my presentation, these would be the ones. 1, manufacturing is generally the most powerful engine for sustained economic growth. 2, almost all least developed countries have little or no manufacturing industry. And 3, least developed countries should upgrade to manufacturing activities in the value chains of products in which they have some global market presence. Now, what does the evidence tell us? I've included this quote from Justin Lin, former chief economist of the World Bank, who says that all countries that remain poor have failed to achieve structural change. That is, they have been unable to diversify away from agriculture and the production of traditional goods into manufacturing and other modern activities. So historically, the manufacturing sector has been the strongest driver of economic development. Now, in other words, countries that have become rich transform materials into raw goods rather than exporting them in unprocessed form. So in a way, I'm also saying that technological advancements are at the root of economic development. Now, although technology doesn't limit itself to the manufacturing sector, most of the innovations that have altered our lives for the better in terms of productivity growth have been manufactured goods. Examples of these are the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, steel ships, aeroplanes, and semiconductors. Now, this figure shows how the world's manufacturing landscape changed during the course of the 200-year period that started with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Asia really dominated the manufacturing scene in the 17th and the first half of the 18th century with silks, porcelain, and textiles. But as you all know, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and some really major technological breakthroughs in steam power and also textile production, technological advancements in the West started to skyrocket in the mid-19th century. So by 1900, the West had really established its industrial world hegemony, making up about 90% of world manufacturing production. So in the early 20th century, the world was really divided into two groups of economies. One was rich and industrialized, and the other was poor and dependent on agriculture. And during this period, actually, GDP growth annually in the West was about 4 times higher than in the rest of the world. So manufacturing production contributed massively to an increase in economic output and economic growth. So after the Second World War, developing countries started their own industrialization drive. Colonial extractive institutions were challenged, meaning that developing countries weren't purely seen as the purpose for extracting natural resources. Technological advances enabled technology transfers across greater distances. And also following decolonization, governments in developing countries were given more autonomy in steering development policies towards their own objectives. Now here you see the differences in manufacturing experiences between the world regions. So the really star performers, I mean, you've seen a process of deindustrialization in most of the world since the early 1980s, especially in the advanced economies, but there are some countries that really expanded its manufacturing sector early in the post-war era, particularly in East Asia. This includes Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan and South Korea, and some other countries followed suit, such as China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile show some impressive industrialization drives. But since the early 1980s, especially these countries have gone through a process of deindustrialization. Now, a few years ago, Michael Spence, famous US economist, was commissioned together with a bunch of other economists and international policymakers to write a report on the only 13 countries in the world that has achieved a GDP growth rate of 7% or more for a sustained period of 25 years. It turns out that out of these 13 countries, all of the countries I just mentioned, who have really expanded their manufacturing base in the post-war era, are included in this group, apart from Brazil and Chile. Additionally, you have Japan, who didn't really expand its manufacturing sector tremendously in the post-war era, but had a strong industrial base. And also you have Botswana, Malta, and Oman. Now, Malta is also a country that expanded its manufacturing base quite rapidly in tandem with experiencing rapid economic growth. Oman and Botswana are two countries with a very, very small population that has amassed its wealth respectively so Oman from oil and Botswana from diamonds. Botswana's GDP per capita is about $7,000, and Oman's is around 20,000, if I'm not mistaken. So it is possible to grow economically without expanding your manufacturing base, but it's very, very uncommon, and it's usually based on some very, very precious natural resources, particularly oil. So the evidence is quite unambiguous. Since the Industrial Revolution, almost, or basically no country without sort of a very idiosyncratic or quirky economic element has managed to go from low income to high income without significantly expanding its manufacturing base. So why is this relationship so strong? Well, first of all, most technological advances since the Industrial Revolution has taken place in the manufacturing sector, and when it hasn't really contributed to productivity growth in that sector, it's diffused from the manufacturing sector and contributed to productivity growth in agriculture and services. In agriculture, examples of goods like these are fertilizers, pesticides, agricultural machinery, what more do we have? Chemicals. And in services, you have transport equipment, computers, mechanized warehouses. In other sector, technological advance is more limited. Agriculture is constrained by the availability of land and climate, and also many service activities will actually have to lower the quality of its service to increase productivity. Some retail services in the UK and the US, who claim to have increased productivity, have actually in reality cut down on shop assistants, dislocated to more inconvenient locations, and in some instances increased the waits for deliveries. Secondly, the manufacturing sector tends to be the strongest driver for paid employment generation, especially for developing countries. Now, the International Labour Organization finds that by comparing world regions, there is a clear positive relationship between the share of industrial employment and total employment and paid employment to population ratio, meaning that the countries have a large share of their labor force in industry also, or in manufacturing, also tends to have a large share of people actually being wage employed, being paid by a wage, especially in developing countries. And also, as per capita income rises, the proportion spent on agricultural goods falls, while that spent on manufacturing goods rises, famously known as Engel's law. So the economic growth thereby creates a market for industrial products and stimulates dynamic opportunities for manufacturing. So in the last decades, more and more arguments have emerged claiming that this is a new age and that some countries can actually become rich or stay rich or grow based on services, right? So services have dominated more and more of today's economies, especially the advanced economies, in terms of both output and employment. And we've also seen a process of deindustrialization in most countries in the world. Also, given massive increases in firm size, it's now more profitable to procure some services from specialist providers rather than producing within a manufacturing firm, which has been the case in the past. The revolutions in information and communication technology and also transport technology make services more tradable. India is often provided as an example of a country that's achieved some economic success through trading its services. But however, manufacturing products are far, far more tradable, whereas low tradability lies in the root of most services, like public utilities, cleaning, grooming, most education, although admittedly some education can also be traded. Manufacturing products are, in theory, all of them are tradable. To provide some facts here, services have been in fact stuck at 20% of international trade, around 20% of international trade, since the 1990s. And in India's case, its trade surplus, between 2004 and 2011, its trade surplus in services covered only 17% of its trade deficit in goods. And this is a balance of payment problems that India will have to face sooner or later. And so yeah, there's some evidence and some theory on manufacturing for you. So how are the African countries doing in this respect, or really the poor countries in the world? So in my research, I look at Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have roughly 80% of the least developed countries in the world. Least developed here is defined by having a per capita income of less than roughly $1,000, which is the World Bank classification. To be completely accurate, it's 1,035 this year, I think. But anyway, 80% of those countries are in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know, some of you might have come across narratives and articles in the media portraying Africa as a rising continent. these sort of arguments, these are front covers taken from the Economies magazine and Time magazine in late 2011. These arguments point to more prudent macroeconomic policies, progress in health and education, reduction in violent conflicts, and most importantly, Africa now holds some of the world's fastest growing economies. Now, while some of these developments I think are unambiguously good, like a reduction in violent conflicts and also progress in health indicators, education, most of these arguments I think are quite nonsense. Let me back up that statement. And here's an article I wrote for The Guardian a couple of months ago. So if you want an 800-word version of why I think Africa is not on the rise and what should be done about it, very briefly, you can have a look at that. Now let's break down the GDP growth that African countries have been experiencing since the since the start of Africa's rise, which is in about the mid-1990s. So it's true that GDP growth has picked up, and it's been quite high in some economies. But in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's very important to distinguish between GDP growth per capita and total GDP growth. The reason is that birth rates in Sub-Saharan Africa have been relatively high. And if we're interested in economic development, we want to look at GDP per capita growth rates. Now, comparing GDP per capita growth rates in Sub-Saharan Africa, so SSA refers to Sub-Saharan Africa, and EAP, East Asia and Pacific, developing countries. So I'm comparing developing countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is basically all of Sub-Saharan Africa, with developing countries in East Asia and the Pacific. And per capita GDP growth rates in the two countries represent green in Sub-Saharan Africa's case and blue in the East Asia and the Pacific case. And on average, over this period of Africa's supposed rise, GDP per capita growth in Sub-Saharan Africa has actually been 4 times lower than that in East Asia and the Pacific, predominantly driven by China. Furthermore, job creation is quite dismal in Sub-Saharan Africa. Around 80% of people who enter the labor market in Sub-Saharan Africa, they get stuck in what the International Labour Organization calls vulnerable jobs. So 80%, these are jobs that are in the informal sector or basically working for your family, which are non-wage jobs. So 80% of people who enter the labor market today in Sub-Saharan Africa end up in jobs without a formal wage. The share of people living in extreme poverty, if we look at a $2 purchasing power parity line rather than a 1.25 line, this rate has barely moved in Sub-Saharan Africa for the past 3 decades. It's been at around 70% of the population, so 70% of people in Africa in the early 1980s lived in extreme poverty, and in 2010 it was about the same, 70%. Comparing this with other developing regions of the world in East Asia and Pacific, this rate was reduced in the same time period from about 90% to 30% of the population. In Latin America, from about 20% to 10% of the population. So in this period of Africa's rise, Africa's share of world poverty has actually been increasing. So the lack of this progress in Sub-Saharan Africa can largely be attributed to the lack of structural transformation, basically transforming production activities from, or relinquishing dependence on agriculture and primary researches, and becoming more advanced and expanding manufacturing base and other modern activities. Africa actually, or most countries in Sub-Saharan Africa actually attempted a drive towards industrializing its economies in the 1950s and 1960s, but this strategy was largely deemed unsustainable. It didn't provide enough foreign exchange, agriculture was neglected, and the firms didn't really become competitive on the world markets. So with the international oil crisis in 1973, a lot of African countries became heavily indebted, and they sought assistance from the World Bank and the IMF, and they gave most African countries this. They gave them loans under the conditions of a complete dismantling of the state under the structural adjustment programs. Now this had So in the early 1960s, you could see that manufacturing, or for example, the manufacturing share of some sub-Saharan African economies started to reach 10-15%. And now the structural adjustment programs, all manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa was almost completely eroded. So this is basically because if you want to build up a cluster of production in an activity that you're yet not competitive in, you need some sort of state involvement, subsidies, credit allocation, tariff protection, a range of instruments, but it just doesn't happen by opening up to world markets. Usually you get stuck in the production structure you have if you just open up to free trade. And since then, more or less, there has been no manufacturing production in Africa. Now let's look a bit more at the individual experiences, or does it really make sense to aggregate manufacturing performance across all of the African continent? Here we see the top 10 manufacturing performers in 2010 measured by manufacturing value added in per capita terms. What you need to know is that this figure is some sort of indication as to how much manufacturing output per head you see in these countries. I've included population figures because a lot of these countries are very, very small. So actually, if you look at just Sub-Saharan Africa, here you see some North African countries as well. If you look at just Sub-Saharan Africa and exclude South Africa, which is a country that admittedly has some manufacturing production, and also then roughly 95% of the population, more than 95, I would go as far as to say 98, 99% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. That's about 800 million people. They live in countries where manufacturing value added per head is lower than $100 in 2010, which is the year where we find the latest available data. Now to put this in perspective, how low is an MVA of less than $100? Some of these countries have $22, but basically less than $100 for almost all of Sub-Saharan Africa. The US has a manufacturing value added per capita of $5,222 in 2010. The UK had about 3,162, Brazil 820, and Brazil 622, and China $820. So the dismal state of the manufacturing sector in Sub-Saharan Africa is quite homogeneous if we exclude South Africa. Also, if we break down, so I'm just going to have a small sip of water and you can look at this table and see what you figure out. Yeah. All right. If we break down the type of manufacturing products that Sub-Saharan African countries produce, it gives reason for further worry. First of all, if we exclude South Africa again, the manufacturing products in high technology sectors, so like aeroplanes, TVs, semiconductors, and so on, these exports haven't even reached $1 billion, while in China, it reached about $551 billion in 2011. Also, Sub-Saharan Africa as a region is losing shares in low technology manufacturing production. Now, this is quite worrying because most countries that are sort of in the early phase of transformation and growth, they show increasing shares, even world shares in this technology category, as it involves a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing, especially in garments and textiles. So in Africa, you have a huge coming wave of young people entering the labor force in coming years that you might have heard of. Some people talk about it as a demographic dividend. I'm more worried that it's going to be a demographic disaster because you have no proper jobs for these young people, no labor-intensive manufacturing. As I told you, 80% of young people, or 80% of people who enter the labor market in Sub-Saharan Africa, they end up in vulnerable jobs. And thirdly, the region is very, very dependent on resource-based manufacturers, and these are the type of manufacturing products that, they add less value than high technology manufacturing products. so they don't generate as much revenue. But resource-based manufacturers, don't get me wrong, is still better than just exporting raw materials in unprocessed form, so just agricultural products or natural resources. So how can least developed countries achieve such a transformation? That's a very bold sort of question to try and approach. I'm gonna give you some points that I think are important in today's context. The first one is, so Africa is basically, I mean, a continent that has a lot of natural resources. It has 42% of its gold, 80 to 90% of chromium and platinum group metals, and maybe most importantly, 60% of the world's arable land, and also vast timber resources. Now, I'm not the type of economist to think that a country should make or produce only what it has sort of a factor endowment advantage in, but still some of these point to the fact that in its manufacturing products, they should somehow try to see what products do they have a global market presence in, and how can we upgrade in the value chain in that product. So for example, how can we make more valuable products in the cocoa value chain, where we already have some global market presence. Now, this concept of global value chains is fairly new, and this is a change in how production of goods take place on a global scale, a change we've seen for the past decades. So global value chains link different value-added stages required to bring a product from conception to the final consumer, usually in different countries. So whereas 50 years ago, the components of an entire car, most of them would be produced in one country, now they're produced in all different countries. And this almost goes for all products. So you'll have, in coffee, you'll have retailing and design taking place in one country and processing taking place in another country, and mostly coffee beans then just exported from African countries. So basically lead firms have outsourced labor-intensive strategies of their production to countries with low cost, and they've thereby moved ownership of their production plants and the vertical integration of all production activities, but they've retained control of the organization of indirect manufacturing activities within the value chains that they drive. So looking at the global value chains of most primary commodities, worryingly, almost all the activities that add more value take place in countries that are richer than those in Sub-Saharan Africa. So for example, in the cocoa value chain, Cameroon and Ghana, they export cocoa beans. Malaysia and Brazil, they make lots of cocoa butter and powder, and Mexico is at a stage higher, making chocolate, right? In the timber value chain, you have the Ivory Coast and Gabon making hopwood, split poles, plywood. Malaysia and Indonesia, they make fiberboard, barrels and casks, while China and Korea, they make tableware and carpentry. So not only will higher value-added stage give producing countries more revenue for these products, but also the production is going to create backward linkages, meaning that there will be high demand for more sophisticated inputs in production of these goods. But there are, however, some difficulties in upgrading in a chain. For the past 20 years, there has been an increase in the proliferation in free trade agreements around the world, making it more difficult for countries basically to change its current production structure. Countries are not allowed, or it's more difficult to be as autonomous in trade policies, like giving subsidies to certain industries for them to thrive, or protecting certain industries with tariffs and so on. Additionally, lead firms in these global value chains seem to have tremendous power in deciding which parts of the production take place in which countries. The market share of these lead firms are tremendous. In the global value chain for tea, for example, so you have 3 companies controlling over 80% of the world market for tea. Now these firms really set the standard that supplier firms have to meet in terms of cost, quality, and lead times. And as it just so happens, the activities that add the most value to the final products of these goods usually take place in the home country of these lead firms, so in the rich countries. Now, bottlenecks general bottlenecks to sort of expand manufacturing production and upgrading global value chains, it differs a lot between countries, between different global value chains as well. I've tried to sort of figure out three bottlenecks that encompass most least developed countries. And these are the three that I've figured out at this stage of my PhD: infrastructure, access to finance, and skills shortage. Sub-Saharan Africa lags behind majorly on most other developing regions when it comes to infrastructure measures. This goes especially for rural road networks and electricity. So crucially, for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, or least developed countries in the world, more investments, both domestically and abroad, need to address this infrastructure gap. Most importantly, investing more money in building up sound infrastructure in energy and also transportation networks. Also, domestic resources to meet financing costs for industrialization are needed. Aid and overseas development assistance are likely to decrease over time. So government revenues and private savings are the main financial resource. Key measures would be to improve tax systems efficiency and stemming capital flight. And also in the future, remittances might offer an increasingly important potential. What about skills? Well, when it comes to manufacturing employment in relatively low technology sectors, there is a shortage of skills. I'm not talking about increasing rates of enrollment or graduation in primary or secondary education. I'm talking about on-the-job skills training, which is very, very important in manufacturing industry, basically tacit knowledge. So a lot of skills that are really learned through the process of production, right? So in a lot of countries that are trying to set up these factories in a lot of least developed countries, workers don't have the necessary or factory discipline or job training that is needed to really work in a high pressure export sector. So, and firms systematically invest too little in on-the-job training, and it's difficult for them to, they don't want to risk investing more money because then they can have their employees obtaining these skills, going to other firms with their competencies, and basically the firm has wasted money. This is an opportunity where the governments in these countries have to figure out some solutions. An example would be for governments to co-finance training programs, set up industry associations, or providing zero interest loans to workers attending accredited programs. Now, the successful implementation of all these policies and consequent a change in a country's production structure necessitates an active government. That's been the case in all examples in the past that have achieved a structural transformation of their economy. And subsequently, this is dependent on the capabilities of a specific government and also the political institutions of a country. Now, a common approach to African countries have been to recommend a common approach by international donor agencies has been to recommend a set of good governance reforms, including stable property rights, a rule of law, democratic accountability, and low corruption. Now, while we can agree that these are institutional features that are very that we all want to achieve, or that rich countries have and that function well, right? Democratic accountability is an end we should aim to meet in itself, and corruption is definitely not a good thing. But poor countries are far from having the financial resources to implement any of these institutions, and they would require tremendous transaction costs, oftentimes sort of ripping apart the informal institutions that exist in these countries. So poor countries are actually running a budget deficits by the time they pay their civil servants. Furthermore, there is very little evidence to support a causal link from good governance to economic development. Now, while there is a correlation between developing and also good governance, a lot of people would argue, well, a lot of prominent academics in this field, like Mushtaq Khan from SOAS, are saying actually there is not a single country in the world that's implemented these type of institutions and subsequently gone through a period of rapid economic growth. He's saying these are transitions that take a lot of time, and the approach we should have now to developing countries is look at the government capabilities, look at really, for example, really where is the corruption that is detrimental to growth, and let's eliminate that corruption. But in certain instances, like in South Korea, this was a system where relationships between state bureaucrats and the private sector was oiled by corruption, with very well-developed insider systems. And corruption was actually an informal tool of credit allocation for big business groups, known as the chaebol, to help them become internationally competitive. So different governments use different approaches. China's another country that doesn't really score well on these governance scores. They've had problems with corruption. Their approach was different to Korea's, which again was different to Japan's approach. But none of these countries that were actually quite successful, like South Korea and Taiwan, I guess these are South Korea and Taiwan are the two best examples of rapid economic growth and transition from low to high income in the post-war era. None of these implemented Western-style parliamentary democracies at early stages of development. Now, while I said that, so what sort of political institutions you try to implement is really dependent on the capabilities of the specific government and the context and the country. I've tried to make some general points here as to what bureaucrats need to keep in mind. So state and business groups should be evenly balanced. At least that's been the case in the successful economic cases of development. A weak state can give business an upper hand, like what happened in Korea's democratization process, where big business escaped national discipline. And public officials engaging in governing the market have operated with a public service-oriented mindset. Of course, it's easier said than done to just tell bureaucrats in least developed countries, hey, operate with a public-oriented mindset. But at least that's a common trait for those successful developers. And also, bureaucrats have been embedded historically in the private sector, but autonomously. So this means that they set, monitored, and adjusted goals through input and feedback of key business actors, but without being captured by business. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, let's take some, let's discuss a bit, yeah? Questions? Yeah, Vincent?
Can you give an example of some skills training within manufacturing that's currently in place in Africa and what that looks like? Certain kind of success stories in that regard?
Success stories of skills training. I mean, there is very, very little manufacturing industry in Sub-Saharan Africa, so I guess you wouldn't really find those success stories in Sub-Saharan Africa. But like, for example, a government providing zero interest loans to workers who attend accredited programs would be like an example of a skills training workers program that could be successful. You know?
You suggested some reforms that have to be implemented within the developing countries. Could you perhaps say something, what should advanced economies do in order to promote?
Okay, so in terms of their aid.
Aid or,
so I guess advanced countries are most involved in the politics of least developed countries through official development assistance. So first of all, I would say that they should have a clear aim of actually focusing on the productive sectors. I mean, I've been talking a lot about manufacturing development in this presentation, but if you actually go, I mean, if you look at for example, I'm from Norway, if you look at the Norwegian Foreign Ministry's sort of aid budget for industrial policy or developing manufacturing industries, it's very, very, very small. So first of all, creating awareness that, hey, this is a very, very important part of development, although protecting the environment, progressing in social sectors, protecting human rights and so on, these are traditionally very, very big points in a aid budget of a government. These are important things. I think the productive sectors need to gain more importance. And there has been some, the state has been given a more important role after the disasters of the structural adjustment programs, but with the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, most attention has been given to the social sectors, like health and education. These are important, but this is one area. Another is more investment into infrastructure. That's like a very tangible thing that I think is very possible without too many other big questions arising that provide problems. Some countries have managed this successfully, actually with some domestic resources. Ethiopia has invested very, very, very heavily in rural road networks and also electricity for the past decade. It's currently building the biggest, one of the 10 biggest hydropower dams in the world. That's going to stand finished in about 2 years. So infrastructure investments, or supporting infrastructure investments from outside countries would be key. Yeah?
Considering kind of how big and widespread corruption can be in these countries, do you think there's an ability of foreign direct investment and charities or things like microfinance to also promote growth without having to go through?
First you said
considering how widespread corruption can be, do you think there are ways beyond just the government to really promote the manufacturing industry?
So the private sector as well, or the foreign investors, I think is completely crucial. In most countries you actually have private firms developing products and then the government supporting them. So some would say that the government sometimes had to take a leading role in developing a new product and sometimes take a supporting role in developing a new product. So for example, in South Korea sometimes when private firms were showing progress in sort of going up a chain of a product or sort of getting to higher value added stages of a product, the government would give them informal subsidies through informal mechanisms to promote that even more. Foreign direct investments, yeah. So in Africa there has been a tremendous increase in foreign direct investments. And sometimes foreign direct investments can be good, sometimes it can be bad. In Sub-Saharan Africa, most of these foreign direct investments are going straight to mineral or oil deposits just for the purpose of extracting natural resources, unfortunately. So when you manage to, for example, let's say import some new technologies and maybe reverse engineer them through foreign direct investments, that can be very, very beneficial. And that's actually a very, very easy opportunity today to develop new technologies. It's basically because of very, very low or drastically reduced transportation costs in today's global economy, it's much easier to reverse engineer products and quickly climb up the technological ladder rather than innovate them yourself. Yeah, Ivan.
Yeah, there have been any attempts to make kind of an OPEC-like organization, but for some other resource that's actually under the control of all the poorer countries? I don't know, cocoa or coffee or something, where it's actually national producers that sell that. So to try through manipulating or controlling the world price for this resource to at least extract more foreign currency from their exports.
You're talking about commodity marketing boards?
Yes.
Yeah?
National and international.
So
I guess international
to
first
keep
and
the
foremost.
prices stable.
Or even increase them.
Yeah, this is actually a point that I'm very glad you make it. It's a very important point. A lot of people say not only is it important for countries who are dependent on primary commodities to sort of achieve this structural transformation into manufacturing just because it's more productive, but also, if you look at, if you look at since 2000, for the past 2-3 decades, if you look at the price trends of a lot of these primary commodities, they've been swinging like crazy. And this creates huge macroeconomic instability and makes macroeconomic policy very, very difficult for the countries that produce cocoa, coffee, and quite a lot of other agricultural goods, minerals as well. So creating an organization that will enable the stability of these prices would be beneficial, I think. And also you say to increase the prices. I mean, since 2002, there has been a surge in the prices of actually natural resources. And a lot of people would say that Africa is growing now because there has been this surge in prices. So I mean, as of now, I guess the validity of creating this thing to increase the prices is not relevant because the prices are booming like crazy. But having growth just a point that just relates to this, having growth being completely dependent on a booming price of primary commodities is not sustainable.
No, I meant to express something.
I know that's what you're not what you're saying. I just thought that this point was.
But so these national marketing boards, I know they used to exist up until the structural adjustment program.
Yes.
Have they been dismantled? Are the countries trying to reintroduce them?
That is a recommendation that, for example, organizations like the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, that is a bit more aligned to people who argue for state involvement. So this is a recommendation that is sort of coming in the fore again, but these national marketing boards or international marketing boards haven't really raised the prominence. But I think that's a good idea. Alicia? Alice?
You said that one of the points is the power balance between local governments and
the private sector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially considering that lots of these governments are not as stable or as strong for all the other reasons that you mentioned. How do you guarantee or how do you enforce such a power balance, especially with international corporations and very, very big influential business groups?
Yeah. How do you basically policies to create an even balance between the private sector and the state? That's a very, very difficult one. Usually it's, the distribution of balance is usually dependent on long historical processes. So some would say that, some historical or some countries are just more prone to industrial policy because they have political institutions more conducive to this type of balance, and some are not. It's an extremely difficult process.
Let me take one aspect of it maybe. Would it be beneficial if the international community supported the local governments to create this balance, or would it be more beneficial to restrict the power of, let's say, international business to influence the local government?
Yes. So one thing, I would say in instances where you have an extremely weak state, surely international or donor agencies should have as an agenda in that country to increase the governance capabilities or the capabilities of the government to actually help and address bottlenecks in the private sector. So that's always been necessary. I think also when it comes to private sector power and the powers of corporations, there is this increasing or an emerging trend that is quite dangerous, which is the power of transnational corporations, especially in poor countries. Because right now, and this is really, really something completely new that a lot of people in academia are trying to come to grasp with, and also policymakers, that companies like, for example, Nestle and you have supermarkets in some other global value chains, they really control what production activities goes on in those countries. And this is another issue that must be addressed, I think, internationally, how to reduce the power that transnational corporations have in really setting the rules of what production activities and what global value chains take place in what countries. That doesn't really touch upon your question initially, but it just made me think of it.
It goes in this direction.
Yeah, because as I told you, the really high value added stages in almost all products, not only commodities, but in also higher technology products, they take place in rich countries. And even though, like some of these transnational corporations say, okay, we'll put our manufacturing intensive stages to some countries in Latin America or East Asia, and like the really high value added stages like retailing, branding, and design, they take place in rich countries. So, and these corporations have no sort of mandate really to be developmental, to say we want, we should have some of our activities, production activities, take place in poor countries because that would help them develop. So this is a massive problem that's going to proliferate, and I think will be a big debate in development economics in years to come. What to do with the power of transnational corporations.
Is there anything in the Sustainable Development Goals, the new goals?
No, nothing about that.
Relates to nothing?
No, of course not. That would be an extremely controversial issue to raise. And more questions? Yeah.
Do you feel government can initiate growth, or do you think that governments are just too weak, their incentives aren't good enough, and there's too much corruption?
In Africa?
Yeah.
I think they definitely can. I think this type of argument that says that in Africa they simply don't have the capabilities, this is an argument quite common, and it's actually very easy to make for a country before it has made this transition. I think in Bad Samaritans, Hajun Chang had a chapter called Lazy Japanese Thieving Germans, in which he pointed out that even before the Japanese developed, everyone just referred to them as lazy, and the Germans, they just stole technology from the UK. To say that they simply don't have I would argue that sure there are some historical factors that make it difficult in the African context to develop. You had civil wars have been extremely rife in the post-colonial era, and arguably the interventions through imperialism of Europeans have made things very difficult there. But there are examples of governments who are extremely developmental, like I touched upon, like Ethiopia, with a sort of very centralized authority and also very little corruption. This has been the fastest growing economy in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also one of the fastest growing economies in per capita terms in the world for the last 15 years. So yeah, sure, while I don't think governance capabilities are the same all over the world, I don't think these sort of labels that this is a country that's just a mess and you can't expect it to develop is very useful. Ivan?
But one thing that just seems to be the case from your lecture is that the prospects are pretty bleak for Africa, to put it lightly. Because even if they do have a developmentalist government that is building up its capabilities and so on and so forth, eventually they'll hit the wall of who, in God's name, in Europe will buy an African product in anything even remotely resembling a modern, the era of modern products. But that goes further throughout the value chain. So why would the firm buy a medium stage product from some unknown firm in Africa when they already have their value chain pretty much sorted out? So it seems that even if you do pursue, and the power of transnational corporations, it's not, to limit them in doing this. The criticism was not new. There was a new economic order in the 70s, kind of the push by the G77 to limit this. This came to nothing, and things have gone even worse since then. So apart from kind of changing the world economic system or something,
the world economic system right now is not very conducive, I think. So one of the things, I've talked a lot about manufacturing products in natural resources, and this would add tremendous value. But if you look at all the countries that actually are in the high value added of cocoa or chocolate or timber, these are not even rich countries. These are Malaysia, this is Brazil. Malaysia is what's almost at high income status, almost at $12,000 per capita. Brazil, China, right? So we're not even talking about trying to make products medium or high technology. So that in itself, they're just struggling at the first stage. And then you have your issues of transnational corporations having so much power, and why would they ever they don't even outsource the really high value added activities to countries who are far ahead of Sub-Saharan African countries, like Mexico and China, and there's much richer than Sub-Saharan Africa, but still has a lot of issues in terms of economic development. Then you have international trade agreements that also poses a problem with the Doha round of negotiations going on with the World Trade Organizations, with the European partnership agreements that basically try to limit Well, they do limit the amount of policy instruments that African governments would have in protecting certain industries. I mean, the general sort of argument from the WTO would be like, over the last 50 years, and this is something you see if you just go to the homepage of the WTO, we've had an increase in world GDP per year this much, and at the same time there's been an increase in international trade in this much. While I think international trade is crucial to development, you can't develop without trading. There's a difference between completely free trade and trading. But in the end, we are not in a world yet where we have international institutions that dominate over the interests of nation states. And as long as African countries, Sub-Saharan African countries, or other countries start competing with the interests and jobs of richer countries, then you would have some sort of intervention through trade agreements and also through transnational corporations that would try to limit this type of development. So we're not yet, I don't think we're in a, South Korea managed, Taiwan managed to actually go from low to high income, but so far there aren't really any, and even now the world is very, very different. So far there aren't really any countries that have managed. So I'm not that positive actually, but I see that there can be made some differences in implementation of policies as to how we should change the status quo today. That would be beneficial, like the ones I touched upon today. And I think, you'll see, I think you'll see higher value-added production taking place in Sub-Saharan Africa, but almost purely based on lower labor costs in Africa than China. Like when labor costs in China rise, we'll see these cheap labor-intensive manufacturing production activities taking place in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, we have to close on this more negative note, but next week we have cooperatives. That's a lot more positive for development. Good prospects.
Well, they're doing better now than in the 80s. Much better.
Okay, thank you.
It's like, I mean,
So they were
a very stark reduction in violence, less civil wars, more growth, and also debt as a share of GDP is going down quite a lot through the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, right? So a lot of rich countries have done well in sort of reducing the debt of Sub-Saharan African countries. That's improving drastically. But yet they're stuck in dependence of natural resources and primary commodities. And that's, I think,
right, no?
Yeah, you'll see some Africa. You'll see Ethiopia, I think. You'll see Rwanda. You'll see maybe Nigeria with this oil cluster. You'll see. Yeah, I think you'll see those three countries, or at least of the poor countries, Ethiopia and Rwanda will reach middle income status quite soon. Maybe Mozambique. But I see this as a very, very long-term process, and in social sciences and economics, it's extremely difficult to predict how the world is going to look in 30, 40 years. So let's hope maybe we'll see some, maybe we'll see a revolution.
Maybe.
Thank you.